In the chaos and turmoil that had surrounded him, Aeneas gathered his family and fled Troy, abandoning the city to the Greek invaders. Desperate for a new home, Aeneas sailed from country to country, journeying across the Mediterranean, when he came upon a fledgling kingdom and its queen, Dido. While there, Aeneas captured the heart of the queen. However, circumstances required him to leave the country. Queen Dido would never forgive Aeneas for what he had done. Before killing herself, she condemned Aeneas and his descendants to eternal damnation. Aeneas' travels would eventually land him in Laurentum, where he and his family, along with a small group of his followers, would create a fledgling city. The surrounding Latins didn't take well to the foreigners, and conflict would soon emerge. The Latin king, Latinus, however, sought peace with Aeneas, and offered his daughter Lavinia to solidify peaceful relations between the two groups. Turnus, prince of the Rutuli, stood in shock that Lavinia had been given to this foreigner, and declared war on the Latins. Aeneas and Latinus defeated the Rutuli, but Latinus was killed in the fight. Aeneas now had sole control over the two groups. The defeated Rutuli then pleaded with the Etruscans in the north to assist them in putting down this invader. The Etruscans agreed and set off with the Rutuli to defeat Aeneas. However, Aeneas defeated the force and created a newfound respect for these Trojan Latin barbarians in the south. Aeneas would eventually die, and his first son Ascanius would inherit the title of king. Ascanius established new cities and developed the Trojan presence on Italy. Upon Ascanius' death, Silvius, first son of Lavinia and Aeneas, would inherit the kingdom for his family and would hold it for generations. Many years later, the kingdom was ruled under Numitor, son of Procas. His brother, Amulius, seized the throne from his brother despite his father's will and killed Numitor's sons to prevent any future disputes of the throne. Amulius took Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, and forced her to become a Vestal virgin, preventing her from giving birth on fear of death. When she came to be pregnant, she blamed the god Mars. Rhea was thrown in prison, and the twins that she gave birth to were brought to the Tiber to be laid to rest. The river was too high, so the soldiers placed the boys in the marsh to be taken by the elements. When the water eventually receded, a wolf came upon the boys and nurtured them to life. Eventually, a nearby herdsman came upon the family and took the boys from the wolf, naming them Romulus and Remus. He would raise the boys to adulthood. As the boys came to age, they decided to raid a group of marauding brigands who lived nearby. In their attempt, Remus was captured, and Romulus just managed to escape. The men brought Remus to the local landowner, the overthrown Numitor. Upon hearing the story of the twins, he concluded that his grandchildren would be about this age now, and he explained to Remus his origins. The herdsman also explained to Romulus his origin, knowing that Remus was in Numitor's custody. Upon hearing this news, the twins formed a plan to overthrow Amulius. With Romulus leading one group and Remus another, the two surprised the king and killed him. Numitor was restored to the throne, and the two decided to create a new city at the location where they had been found by the wolf. When they arrived, they fell into an argument on the matter of who would rule the new city. They decided to give the decision to the gods, and the two men went to two separate hills, Romulus to the Palatine and Remus to the Aventine, to await a sign. 6 vultures then landed at Romulus's feet, showing his position as declared by the gods. Remus remained unsatisfied, and the two brothers fought. Remus was killed, and Romulus became the first king of Rome. Over time, the city's population grew, as the outcasts from the surrounding cities began to flock to Rome. The undesirables eventually grew to a large enough population to create Rome's first legion of 3,000 able-bodied men. The more wealthy of the population formed the first council of 100 senators to help the king govern the plebeians. The city's population was disproportionately male, and in order for Rome to have a future, Romulus would need to find women. When the men of Rome traveled outside the city's confines, they found the fathers of the women nearby wouldn't allow their daughters to marry the vile Romans. To settle this issue, Romulus invited all of the neighboring people to a great festival to celebrate the god Neptune. During the celebration, the Romans all suddenly abducted the attending women, and the men were forced to flee. The foreign men attempted to retrieve their women several times, but the Romans continued to fight them off. But one tribe, the Sabines, had not yet attacked. They bribed a young girl to let them into the citadel and took it before the Romans could react. In response, Romulus gathered an army and attacked the stolen citadel. As the battle raged on, the Sabine women intervened and begged their fathers and husbands to stop fighting, and pleaded with them to understand that their tribes were now intertwined. The two groups heard the woman's plea and decided to join together. The Sabine king, Titus, ruled jointly with Romulus, and the Senate doubled in size, consisting of 100 Sabines and 100 Romans. Romulus formed the first citizen assembly, dividing the tribes into 10 groups each. naming each after a captured Sabine woman. Each group had one vote, which could be used to elect magistrates or to enact new laws. The unification also saw the doubling of the legions to a total of 6,000 men. Titus ruled jointly with Romulus for 5 years, but was killed in a mob in the city of Levidium. Romulus decided to remain neutral in the matter. The Sabines were furious, but feared Romulus, so they remained quiet. Romulus became the sole ruler of the people and developed the Romans to a respectable status in Italy. One day while Romulus was reviewing the legion, a storm erupted and clouds surrounded Romulus. Lightning struck, and when the clouds faded, Romulus had disappeared. 6 more kings would come to rule Rome succeeding Romulus. Numa Pompilius, elected by the citizen assembly after the exit of Romulus. Tullius Hostilius, then elected after the death of Numa. Ancus Marcius, grandson of Numa, elected after the death of Tullius. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the first Etruscan king of Rome, became regent after the death of Ancus and was eventually elected king. Servius Tullius seized kingship after the assassination of Lucius. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, who assassinated Servius and took the throne. Lucius would be the last of the Roman kings. While he was away on a campaign, his son raped a noblewoman. The Roman noblemen had enough of the tyrannical leadership of the king and the royal family. They gained the support of the Roman aristocracy and the people, and expelled Lucius with the support of the army. The Roman kingdom had been ended, and the Republic elected the first 2 consuls to rule the city. The Republic had been formed. Upon the creation of the Republic, Rome faced a new threat. The growing Latin cities had formed an alliance, known as the Latin League. The Latins declared war on Rome, seeking to obtain Rome's strategic place on the Tiber and its valuable grazing land. However, they were the first to encounter the Roman phalanx, a formation adopted from the Greeks, consisting of tightly ordered armored spearmen. To the primitive Latin armies of the time, the imposing wall of spears was undefeatable. The Romans defeated the Latin League at the Battle of Lake Regillus, and the Latins formed a new alliance with Rome at the forefront. The Latins merged with the Romans easily due to their cultural similarity. The expanded republic now faced a new enemy to the south, namely the Volsci, who were advancing northward into Roman territory. The Romans pushed the larger Volsci force back and retrieved the lost territory. Rome then faced another enemy to the east, the mountainous Sabines, who had broken relations with Rome and consistently allied with its enemies, namely the Aquians, another tribe of mountain men who constantly raided Roman cities and villages. During this turmoil, the powerful Etruscan city of Veii began to make moves against Rome, wanting its position on the Tiber for its own. A war erupted, and the legendary figure of Marcus Furius Camillus led the assault on the Etruscan border cities, until eventually Rome took Veii. To the north, however, unknown to the Romans in their small struggles in central Italy, a swarm of Gauls fled into the Etruscan north, and faced the Romans at the Battle of Alia, where Rome's 6 legions were crushed and forced to retreat. The Gauls then advanced on Rome and sacked the city. The Romans were forced to bribe the invading Northmen to leave the city. The Romans considered abandoning the looted city and establishing the city of Veii as the capital, but decided to rebuild Rome and maintain it as the capital. They built the Servian Wall to prevent any future occupation from taking place. Rome recovered quickly and used the destruction from the Gauls to their advantage in securing the Republic. The Gauls would continue to raid the countryside, but never again raided Rome. To the southeast were the people known as the Samnites, descendants of the Sabines who controlled the Alpine mountains and had allied with Rome against Gaul. The Samnites had recently invaded the coastal lands of Campania. The locals reached out to Rome for help in pushing the Samnites out of their territory. Rome came and defeated the Samnites, and installed a garrison in Campania territory in Capua. However, unexpectedly, the Roman army stationed there mutinied, which inspired the Latin League to also revolt. The Romans signed a peace treaty with Samnium and put down the uprising with the help of the Samnites. After reconquering all of the Latin cities, Rome abolished the Latin League and decided to govern each city separately, giving some cities full citizenship, some partial citizenship, and others were simply Roman allies or even colonies. This meant the cities were no longer on even levels with each other, and they would need to go to Rome to solve any potential grievance, which kept Rome dominant in the years to come. Peace between Rome and the Samnites would last for years, until border disputes emerged as Roman colonists pushed further south. The friction developed until finally, full-scale war broke out in 326 BC. Rome was largely successful in the early stages of the war, securing the southern city of Neapolis and winning several battles in Samnium. But Rome's dominance in the war quickly shifted in the Battle of Caudine Forks in southern Samnium. Rome's phalanx, however successful it was in Latium, couldn't navigate properly in the mountainous Samnian territory, and they were easily outmaneuvered and crushed in the battle. The humiliated Romans were forced to surrender and had their armor and weapons taken, as well as 600 hostages, and they marched shamefully back to Rome. Rome was forced to sign a peace treaty, giving all of its land gains to Samnium. However, this 5-year peace treaty turned out to be a blessing for the Romans. The Romans recovered their strength and forged new weapons, and most importantly, adopted a new system of fighting. The phalanx, adopted from the Greeks, proved too inflexible against the Samnites, so the Romans created the maniple system. In the new system, the spear wall was forgone, and the men adopted the sword and shield for easier flexibility in hand-to-hand combat, as well as javelins to give the Romans a much-needed range weapon. The army was arranged in a crisscross pattern for better maneuverability. The new system also incorporated reserve troops, known as the triarii, who were the most experienced and skilled fighters, still equipped with spears, likely veterans from the earlier wars of Rome. During the peace, the Romans also forged alliances with the states surrounding Samnium, Apulia, and Lucania. Rome bolstered its borders and prepared for the coming war. However, after the war resumed, Rome faced several defeats at the hand of the Samnites, who had allied with some of the Etruscan cities to the north, and as war progressed, Rome looked more and more like the losing side. But just as the fate of Rome seemed sealed, Rome drove off the Etruscan force and retrieved the lands lost in Campania. The Romans pushed into Samnite territory, and the Samnites came to terms with the Romans. Rome constructed roads down through Capua, securing the land for Rome and strengthening the Roman territory. Rome was now the most powerful force in Italy. The surrounding people groups around Rome had become fearful of Rome's new strength, and they began to ally against the growing threat. Rome fought wars against the Etruscans and the Umbrians in the north, as well as the remnants of the Gauls, still in Italy, and then they resumed war against the Samnites in 298 BC. Rome had defeated each of these groups individually, but they now faced an alliance on the scale unseen before by the Romans. The Romans did not fear this new alliance, however, and they launched raids against the Etruscan cities to the north, simultaneously sending armies to the east to face the Samnites. The army to the east defeated the Samnites, however, they allowed the enemy to flee. The Samnites headed north to meet up with their new allies. This left the Samnite homeland open for Roman pillaging. The Romans knew that they could not defeat the entire army, so they launched several armies against the Etruscan and Umbrian cities, forcing the army to split up to defend their homeland. The war culminated in the Battle of Centium, where the Roman force annihilated the allied army in the biggest battle to have taken place in Italy to that date. Rome now controlled most of Italy, with the exception of the Greek city-states in the south. Rome began to push south with the intention of conquering the entire Italian peninsula, slowly taking city by city. Due to the Greeks' disunification, the Romans could easily exploit each city to Rome's advantage. One of such instances saw Rome send a fleet of ships to the Gulf of Tarentum to aid the city of Thurii. The powerful city of Tarentum had signed a peace treaty with Rome, stating that Rome could not send ships into the Gulf. The Roman ships were sunk, and Rome responded by ravaging the Tarentum countryside. Tarentum resorted to seeking aid from a Greek general, known as Pyrrhus, one of the men who had seized power after the death of Alexander the Great, who ruled over the most powerful kingdom in Greece, and had aspirations of creating a vast empire for himself. Pyrrhus gladly accepted the request of Tarentum, and amassed an army before landing in Italy. The Romans faced Pyrrhus in the Battle of Heraclea, where Pyrrhus claimed his first victory when he deployed Indian war elephants on the Romans, turning the tides of battle. Pyrrhus then reincorporated the Greek city-states that Rome had recently acquired, and pushed north, sacking Campania and Latium. He reached Rome and attempted to negotiate with the city. The Romans refused to negotiate, and Pyrrhus was forced to leave the city because Rome's army was still somewhere in Italy. Pyrrhus traveled throughout Italy, attempting to encourage the tribes underneath the Romans to mutiny against Roman rule, but was surprised by the loyalty of the Italians to Rome. However, not all of the Italians were loyal. Rome's long-term rival, the Samnites, had allied with Pyrrhus. Rome attempted to block Pyrrhus from reaching Samnium in the Battle of Asculum, but they were defeated again by Pyrrhus's war elephants, despite deploying anti-elephant chariots. However, Pyrrhus had realized that although he was winning the battles, he was not winning the war, as Rome could resupply men and other resources far better than Pyrrhus could. He attempted to sign a treaty with the Romans, but the Romans would not allow him to stay in Italy, and they signed a treaty with Carthage to drive out this invader. Pyrrhus sailed to Sicily to defeat the Carthaginians, but he had left his allies in Italy open to the Romans. He returned to Italy to face the Romans for the last time in the Battle of Beneventum. The Romans defeated Pyrrhus finally and expelled him from Italy. The Romans then incorporated Tarentum, as well as the other Greek city-states, into Rome, and they finally controlled all of Italy. But although the Carthaginians had allied to Rome to deal with the threat of Pyrrhus, that peace wouldn't last for long, and Rome began to look outside of Italy. Carthage had been a world power for centuries, before Rome had even been noticed in the Mediterranean. Carthage feared Rome so little that they allied with the Romans to fend off what they saw as the more powerful enemy, Pyrrhus. Carthage controlled the trading ports all throughout the Mediterranean, and enforced the ports with the largest navy in the Mediterranean, consisting of entirely mercenary troops. Carthage had few citizen soldiers, and simply used its immeasurable wealth to form the majority of its armed forces. The two forces met each other for the first time in Sicily, where Carthage had controlled most of the western portion of the island, and the powerful Greek city-state, Syracuse, controlled the eastern half. However, during a war with Carthage, Syracuse had hired a group of mercenary soldiers, known as the Mamertines, who after fighting the Carthaginians, captured the eastern city known as Messana. Syracuse was furious and moved against the Mamertines. The Mamertines panicked and called for help from the Carthaginians. However, it began to become clear to them that they could not trust Carthage for long, and they called to Rome for assistance. The ancient enemies, Carthage and Syracuse, allied together to defeat the new force. Carthage blockaded the city by sea, and Syracuse blocked it by land. Rome burst through the two and saved Messana. Rome would then send 2 full consular armies to Syracuse to force them to ally to Rome, and secured the eastern half of Sicily. Rome would then move on to establish a foothold in central Sicily, at the city of Agrigentum. Rome formed a blockade around the city for 5 months, but just as the city began to face serious starvation, Carthaginian reinforcements from Africa had cut off the Roman supply routes from Syracuse. After letting the Romans starve, Agrigentum could not hold out any longer, and demanded the Carthaginian army to fight the Romans. The Romans won a huge victory, and the Carthaginians were forced to flee. The Romans entered the city and secured a foothold in central Sicily. When the Romans returned home, they used a beached Carthaginian warship they found on the coast of Sicily and reverse engineered the ship to create a new navy. Rome could now step out of Italy in earnest. The result was several upsets on the islands off the north coast of Sicily. The overconfident Carthaginians attempted to crush the newly created Roman fleet and were defeated in battle after battle. Several western Sicilian cities revolted in favor of Rome, and the future of Sicily began to become clear. Total Roman domination was imminent, but Rome began to believe that they could achieve total victory by bringing the fight to the Carthaginians and invading Africa. Rome constructed a new fleet for this task. The massive Roman fleet of 330 ships met the Carthaginians' 350 ships. The largest naval battle in history to take place up to that point would take place at the Battle of Cape Economus. The Romans crushed the fleet and moved on to Africa, and continued to defeat the armies Carthage could muster. But when they were near to Carthage itself, the Carthaginians resorted to hiring Xanthippus, a Spartan general, to defeat the Romans. Xanthippus marched on the encroaching Romans and defeated them, sending the Romans back to the coast to flee from Africa. After rebuilding a new fleet, the Romans lost yet another crushing defeat, this time at the hands of nature itself, losing most of the fleet in a violent storm. Carthage seized the opportunity and pushed down the west coast of the island. The Brazilian Romans constructed another fleet and attempted to capture the key city of Lilybaeum, but they were repulsed. The Romans then moved on to successfully raid Africa, but yet again, they had most of their fleet destroyed in a large storm. However, the Romans continued to make gains in northern Sicily, despite the wrath of nature. The Romans put the city of Lilybaeum at siege yet again, and after several back-and-forth victories, and yet another storm destroying Rome's fleets, Carthage sent Hamilcar Barca to secure Sicily. Hamilcar deployed hit-and-run tactics to delay the Romans, and was winning several small victories. Carthage amazingly decided to focus on the northern coast of Africa, rather than rebuilding a fleet to take Sicily. Rome constructed another fleet, and easily defeated Carthage in the Battle of the Gates Islands. Hamilcar fled Sicily, and Rome finally controlled all of Sicily. However, Carthage had found itself in an impossible position. After paying Rome the gigantic war reparations, the mercenaries who had fought with them in Sicily demanded their payment. The mercenaries revolted after being dissatisfied with what Carthage had gave them, and it seemed that Carthage would fall. But just as doom was assured, Hamilcar was reinstated to put down the men. But after several successes, Carthage lost more and more allies, until the rebels put Carthage itself to siege. The only place Carthage could turn to was Rome. Rome accepted and helped Carthage, wanting Carthage to live to pay the rest of the war operations. With supplies coming by sea from Rome, Hamilcar could push out and defeat the rebels. He wiped out the rebels and reunited northern Africa under Carthage. Carthage then looked out to reacquire Sardinia, which had revolted along with the mercenaries in Africa. They looked to Rome to help, but Rome decided to seize Sardinia and Corsica from Carthage, and told Carthage that if they attempted to take the islands, it would mean war. Carthage forfeited the islands, but Hamilcar, who had become the most powerful man in Carthage, knew the war with Rome would come. Hamilcar decided that if Carthage was to become powerful enough to defeat Rome, it would need more territory. So he set off with his son, Hannibal, to conquer the new territory. While there, in one of the most famous events to take place in the battle between Carthage and Rome, Hamilcar held his 9-year-old son above a fire and made him promise to never be a friend of Rome. Hannibal responded, "I swear, so soon as age will permit, I will use fire and steel to arrest the destiny of Rome." As Hamilcar conquered the tribes of the Iberian Peninsula, they attempted to send word to Rome, who asked Hamilcar what he was doing. He responded that he was simply conquering them in order to pay Rome. During the conquests, Hamilcar died in a battle with one of the native tribes, but the territorial gains he made would provide the foothold for future expansions into the peninsula. Hannibal continued to make progress in Iberia where his father had left off, and he defeated several tribes until the only major force standing against him was the city of Saguntum. The city called out to Rome for assistance, and although Rome had agreed not to engage in matters to the south of the Ebro River, Rome agreed nonetheless. However, Rome never came to the aid of the city, and Hannibal eventually conquered the city. Roman envoys were sent to Carthage to demand them forfeit Hannibal or face war. The Carthaginian Senate was outraged. Rome had just broken the agreement in Saguntum. The envoys told the Senate that it was their decision, peace or war. The Senate responded that it was the envoys who should decide. The envoys decided for war. Hannibal began his operation, dispatching envoys to the Gallic tribes in the north to plan his assault on Italy. It was there that Carthage came to know of Rome's recent conquests of the northern land in Italy surrounding the Po River. He discovered that these recently conquered tribes hated Rome and were ready to assault the Republic with him. As Hannibal crossed the Ebro, he defeated several native tribes and pushed on through the Pyrenees Mountains. Rome decided to respond by splitting up their forces, sending some to stop Hannibal and some to invade Africa, while the rest were sent to the north to deal with the Gallic revolts on the Po. Hannibal continued to defeat native tribes and eventually entered the Alps, barely evading the Roman army sent to stop him. The trek through the Alps proved to be the most difficult and impressive feats in history. Along the way, the army faced several native tribes who would assault the army in every way imaginable, lying to Hannibal and letting him pass, only to wrap behind him while the army passed through a narrow corridor, all the while hurling boulders from atop the men. After drudging through the harsh conditions, the tired army finally crossed the Alps. Hannibal found that many of the tribes of the Po had forgone allegiance to him, but after crushing the Roman army sent to confront him, all of the Gallic tribes of Italy pledged to Hannibal. Hannibal continued to defeat the shocked Romans and advanced through southern Italy. Hannibal was genius as a general and continued to defeat the Roman armies sent to stop him, crushing the Romans like had never been seen before. Rome panicked and elected Quintus Fabius Maximus as Roman dictator to respond to the terrifying threat of Hannibal. Hannibal continued to wreak havoc on the countryside, as his men pillaged the cities that did not ally to Hannibal. Hannibal planned to follow through the same strategy that Pyrrhus once had. That was to convince the Italian cities to abandon Rome in favor of him. But none of the Italian cities turned traitor, and the situation in Iberia was proving positive for Rome. Hannibal seized the city of Cannae, and Rome amassed a large army of 86,000 men to confront Hannibal at the city. The battle resulted in the worst defeat that Rome had ever faced. Hannibal encircled the Roman army and slaughtered the Romans, in yet another genius strategy. Hannibal was now the main power in Italy, controlling the coast, and with no Roman army to contest him, Italian cities began to fall to his side. But Rome refused to give in. They would not accept negotiations. But Hannibal never received aid from Iberia or Carthage. However, new allegiances in Syracuse and Macedon began to strengthen his position further. Rome would train new legions, and they would not fall for Hannibal's tricks any longer. A war of attrition began for the control of Italy. Hannibal attempted to gather a support base of Italian cities, but could never find his footing, and as his terror began to die down, Rome was winning in Iberia and securing the holdings in Sicily and Sardinia. Rome moved on to Macedon to defeat the Macedonian king Philip V and prevented him from invading Italy and supporting Hannibal. When Rome attempted to siege Syracuse for betraying their alliance, the famous inventor Archimedes' insane inventions caused the Romans to simply wait out the city to starve. Rome would eventually take the city and firmly control all of Sicily against Carthage. However, in Iberia, the famous Scipio Africanus decided to move on Africa against Carthage, as Hannibal had done in Italy. After strengthening his army in Sicily, Scipio moved on to Africa and crushed several armies after landing. Carthage itself was in danger, and it called out to Hannibal to return to Carthage to defend the city. The frustrated genius left Italy, and met Scipio in person before the decisive battle of Zama. Scipio and his ally Massinissa, king of Numidia, who had changed sides to fight with the Romans, faced Hannibal's larger force. Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal, and Carthage sued for peace. Carthage was forced to forfeit all of the elephants, ships, and Roman prisoners, as well as recognize the new territories of Numidia under King Massinissa. Along with the war reparations, Rome also took southern Spain. Rome was now the master of the Mediterranean. After securing their territory in Iberia and northern Italy, Rome moved on to conquer the land in Macedon and Illyria, as well as fighting with the Greeks against the Seleucid Empire. Rome decided to conquer Carthage for good, and after the last of the war reparations had been paid, war moved back to Carthage. Carthage was put to siege, and Rome eventually assaulted the city. Most of the population had starved to death, but the surviving population was sold into slavery. Carthage had become a Roman territory in northern Africa. Thus, the Great Punic Wars had come to an end. After the defeat of Carthage, Rome could now move throughout the Mediterranean with absolute freedom. The wars with Carthage had taught Rome how to fight multiple battles on all fronts, and Rome would continue to use this skill in the wars to come. Rome secured Greece under the Republic and conquered the rest of Iberia. Rome would then continue its expansion and annexed Asia. A civil war broke out in the province of Numidia, Rome's greatest ally in the wars against Carthage. The civil war pitted two brothers against each other for control of the region. Rome intervened when Jugurtha executed his brother Adherbal, as well as Roman citizens. Rome defeated Jugurtha and annexed the country as a client state. But while Rome was growing at an unprecedented rate, nomadic barbarians in the north had arrived at the Republic's doorstep. The massive alliance of tribes that Rome had never seen before stood before the Roman armies under Boiorix, the barbarian king. The Roman army was crushed, and Boiorix moved through the Alps into Gaul, where he was met with the largest Roman army amassed since the Second Punic War. The battle resulted in total Roman annihilation. The Roman generals were conflicted amongst themselves, and Rome lost 120,000 men. Boiorix, however, did not march on Rome after the victory, and instead moved through the Pyrrhene Mountains, crushing the armies that Rome threw at him one by one. After raiding northern Iberia, he returned to Rome, where they had prepared a massive army for him. The barbarians were finally defeated, and Boiorix was killed. Rome had secured its northern border. However, as Rome continued to dominate outside of Italy, social unrest began to boil from within. Several Italian cities had grown tired of the treatment of the Roman Senate. Italian cities supplied a majority of the Roman men for legions, and received very little rights as citizens. When the cities allied together under the man Marcus Livius Drusus to propose to the Senate to give citizenship to all Italian Romans, the idea was rejected and Drusus was executed. This only furthered the Italians' anger, who declared war on Rome. The allies brought together a massive army of 120,000 men, consisting of several individual armies controlled by the Italian tribes. The allied army initially defeated Rome in several battles, but just as Rome was about to be forced off the cliff, Rome recovered and fended off the traitors. After defeating the Italians, Rome offered full citizenship to every Italian city that did not betray Rome. However, during the Civil War, a man known as Sulla had proved himself to be an admirable general, and was elected as consul after the war had ended. But the bitter old general Marius hated Sulla and attempted to convince the Senate to end Sulla's run as consul. The Senate was sent into chaos, and Sulla was forced to flee Rome. Sulla returned with 6 legions and entered the city. Several of Marius's allies were executed, while the man himself barely managed to escape to Africa, and Sulla was declared dictator. Sulla then sailed to Asia to face the king Mithridates VI, who had been conquering the Roman territory in the province. However, as Sulla fought the foreign war, Marius had amassed an army in Africa and landed in Rome, and with the help of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, took the city and executed everyone loyal to Sulla. After declaring Sulla exiled, he had himself and his ally Cinna elected consuls. Marius died shortly after, and Cinna was left with full control of Rome. An army was sent to Asia to defeat Sulla, but was itself defeated. Cinna was killed in a mutiny in Rome, and Sulla landed his army unopposed in Rome. After crushing the remaining rebels, Sulla was once again instated dictator, and was the first Roman to hold the position of dictator with no limit to the time that position could last. However, Sulla would forfeit the title and return Rome to the normal consular government, where he ran and was elected. Rome's border began to be pushed eastward as client states were converted to Roman provinces. And then, Rome saw the creation of an alliance between the three most powerful men in the empire. Julius Caesar, son-in-law of Cinna, allowed to live by Sulla, who later regretted his decision, stating, "In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses." Crassus, a general under Sulla during his war against Marius, heralded as the richest man in Rome's history. Pompey, another commander under Sulla, who gave him the title Magnus, or the Great, who defeated Rome's enemies from Iberia to Armenia. These three men formed the triumvirate. However, the alliance fell into disarray when Crassus, who was off on a campaign against the Parthians, died in a crushing defeat at the Battle of Carthage. Crassus's death resulted in the Senate allying with Pompey, declaring him the sole consul, while Caesar was ordered to resign from his position in the army. The Senate feared Caesar's political control because the people loved him. Caesar refused and marched with his army of a single legion on Rome. When he crossed the Rubicon River that separated Gaul and Italy, he violated Roman law, thus declaring civil war. As Caesar marched, the legions that were thrown at him by Pompey and the Senate began to flock to his side. The Senate, as well as Pompey, fled to Greece. Caesar then ordered his men to march to Hispania and crush Pompey's forces stationed there. When Caesar returned to Rome, he was appointed dictator, with Mark Antony as master of horses, or second in command. He kept the title for 11 days and was elected consul once again. Caesar then moved to Illyrium to crush Pompey for good. Pompey's larger army was defeated by Caesar, but Pompey managed to flee to Egypt, where he was assassinated by King Ptolemy XIII. Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt nonetheless, where he was offered the head of Pompey by one of Ptolemy's men. Caesar was saddened, disgusted, and angered by this fact. He then sided with Cleopatra VII, who was in a civil war with Ptolemy. Caesar defeated Ptolemy's army at the Battle of Alexandria, and installed Cleopatra as pharaoh. After defeating the rest of Pompey's supporters in Africa, and then chasing the fleeing force to Hispania, where he crushed the last remnants of Pompey's supporters. Caesar was then named dictator for eternity, and was subsequently assassinated by the Senate. After Caesar's death, the second triumvirate came to power, this time enacted by official Roman law. Octavian, grandnephew and adopted son of Caesar and heir to the power that he held. The only other son of Caesar's was Caesarion, whose mother, Cleopatra, prevented him from being ruler in Roman law due to her foreign blood. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted general and supporter, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, another of Caesar's generals. However, just as the first triumvirate, the second eventually saw tensions grow. Although Caesar gave Octavian power and his will, Mark Antony and Lepidus had allied together to claim themselves the successors to Caesar. Antony refused to acknowledge Octavian, and when Antony denied Octavian the large sum of Caesar's fortune signed to him in Caesar's will, Octavian borrowed money to fulfill the money promised to the army and the people by Caesar. The Roman people began to view Antony as a dictator, and Octavian as the true successor to Caesar. When Antony was given the provinces of Macedonia and Syria to govern, rather than the Gaul, which had been given to one of Caesar's assassins, Antony marched north against the man. The Senate declared Antony an outlaw. Octavian and two consuls marched to face Antony. Antony's forces were defeated at the Battle of Mutina, but both consuls were killed, leaving Octavian sole commander. Antony escaped along with his lover, Cleopatra, and met Lepidus in Hispania, where Lepidus's men joined with Antony. The Senate began to make moves to put an end to Caesar's successors, giving control of the army to the remaining descendants of Pompey, and relinquished Octavian from his command. However, the men under him refused to follow Caesar's enemies, and remained under Octavian. Octavian allied with Antony to provide a unified front against the enemies of Caesar, and marched on Rome, easily taking the city. Octavian made himself consul, and made the descendants of Pompey outlaws. He then traveled to Gaul to meet Antony, where the triumvirate discussed the matter of rule. They agreed to divide the empire amongst themselves, and to unify to put down the remainder of Caesar's assassins. Mark Antony and Octavian crushed the enemy at the Battle of Philippi. Mark would set off against the Parthian Empire with the aid of Cleopatra's Egypt. However, the Romans were crushed. With more aid from Cleopatra, Antony successfully invaded Armenia and declared his allegiance with Octavian finished. The two men met at sea to decide the fate of Rome at the Battle of Actium. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, crushed the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The two lovers fled to Egypt, but Octavian gave chase and invaded. With nowhere to escape, and with what seemed like the whole world against them, Mark Antony committed suicide. Cleopatra would commit suicide soon after Octavian captured Egypt. Octavian took the title of pharaoh and ordered the death of Caesarion, son of Cleopatra and Caesar, stating that 2 Caesars are one too many. Octavian then slowly took more and more power in Rome, as the most powerful man in the world. The Senate would give Octavian the title Augustus, meaning illustrious one. Augustus had become the first Roman emperor. Augustus gave himself the title Princeps Civitas, or first citizen of the state, and Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, or Commander Caesar, son of the deified one. Augustus gave power and acknowledgement to the Senate, leaving the guise of the Republic for the Senate as well as the Roman people, but held most of the power in Rome. Augustus donated large sums of money to the treasury as the richest man in Rome, in order to not only construct new roads and aqueducts, but also new institutions that he founded. Firefighting services, along with a courier, were funded, as well as a new standing army, enlisting all male Roman citizens to be draftable for military service. He also created the Praetorian Guard, which would serve as protectors of the emperor and would become a large force in Rome's future. He also expanded the empire's reach, annexing not only Egypt, but Dalmatia, Pannonia, Noricum, Raetia, and parts of Germania. He signed a peace treaty with the Parthians, retrieving war captives lost by Crassus and Antony. Augustus would fall ill, and on his deathbed, spoke to the Roman people, "I have found Rome of clay, I leave it to you of marble." And to his close friends, "Have I played my part well? Then applaud me as I exit." The Senate declared him a god, as they had Caesar. Before his death, Augustus married Livia Drusilla, adopting her son Tiberius. Tiberius inherited his father's name and became Tiberius Julius Caesar. When he came to power, the legions in Germania had mutinied after not being paid by Augustus during his rule. Tiberius sent the general Germanicus to put down the soldiers. Germanicus not only calmed the mutineers, but also rallied them and invaded deep into Germania. When Germanicus returned home, he was celebrated by the people, and in response to his success, he was given control of the eastern part of the empire. He would later die of suspected poisoning. Tiberius grew tired of politics and moved to the island of Capri. During his leave, the Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, became more and more prominent in Rome. He controlled Rome itself and began purging senators who did not support him. He exiled 2 of Germanicus's loved sons from the city, where they would later die, and began to form a relationship with Germanicus' daughter, Julia. It became clear that Sejanus had ambitions of overthrowing the emperor, and though he attempted to block communications to Tiberius on Capri, the Senate finally received orders from the emperor to execute him. Sejanus and his allies were purged from Rome. The only surviving son of Germanicus, Caligula, was adopted by Tiberius, who entrusted the empire to him, and his grandson, Gemellus. Tiberius died and was not revered as a god in his death. Caligula began his rule by executing Tiberius Gemellus. Caligula led a fairly peaceful reign, constructing more roads and aqueducts throughout the empire, but he also annexed Mauretania into Rome, finally. He would eventually be assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, who were ordered to do so by the Senate, who hoped to return Rome to the Republic. Instead, on the same day that Caligula was killed, the Praetorian Guard declared Claudius, uncle of Caligula and brother of Germanicus, emperor. Claudius was the first Roman emperor born outside of Italy in Gaul. Claudius began the resumption of war outside of the empire. Claudius's general began the Roman invasion of Britannia, and secured the area for future Roman invasions. He was poisoned by his wife, and his adopted son Nero became emperor. Agrippina ruled alongside Nero in the early years of his reign, until he had her murdered under suspicion that she was the assassin of Claudius. Nero annexed the kingdom of Bospora, and he sent the general Vespasian to quell a revolt in Judea. However, in 68, Vindex, governor of a province in Gallia, allied with Galba, governor of another province in Hispania. Vindex was defeated and committed suicide. However, Galba gained the support of the Senate and the army, and Nero fled Rome, where upon learning of being condemned to death, committed suicide. Galba ruled for a short time until the legions in Germany denounced Galba and declared their leader, Vitellius, emperor. The Senate hated Galba, and the nobleman Otho had Galba assassinated before he could face Vitellius. The Praetorian Guard appointed him emperor, and the Senate welcomed him. After several small victories, Vitellius defeated Otho, who committed suicide. Vitellius was welcomed by the Senate. He held several banquets and celebrations, which incurred a large debt. When asked to repay the debt, Vitellius simply executed the lenders. Meanwhile, Vespasian had not only quelled the Jewish revolt, but was now declared emperor by the eastern provinces. Vespasian sent his general Marcus Antonius Primus to Rome with the army. Before he could reach Italy, the legions in Raetia and Moesia invaded Italy and defeated Vitellius, declaring Vespasian emperor. Vitellius attempted to flee, but was found and killed. The Senate declared Vespasian emperor, and the civil war ended. After rebuilding the empire from the damage done by the civil wars, Vespasian sent the general Agricola to Britannia to push further in and consolidate land. He would march into Scotland and begin Rome's advance in the new territory. As Vespasian neared death, he reportedly uttered the words, "Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god." His son Titus would take his place as emperor. Titus would complete the Colosseum and donate to the city of Pompeii after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. He would die young of natural causes, and Domitian, second son of Vespasian, came to power. Domitian ruled aggressively, and the Senate had disdain for him. Domitian solidified the borders. He was loved by the people and the army, but was assassinated by the Senate. Nerva, one of Domitian's advisors, was elected by the Senate to become emperor, and he was the first emperor to come to power in such a way. Nerva couldn't control the army, and a revolt by the Praetorian Guard forced him to adopt Trajan, a respected general. Nerva died of a stroke, and Trajan became emperor. Trajan was educated as a soldier and would continue the empire's expanse. He began by conquering Dacia. He then moved against the Parthians in Mesopotamia and reached the Persian Gulf, becoming the first emperor to do so. Under Trajan, Rome reached its greatest extent, stretching from modern-day Scotland to Iran. He had plans to push further into the lands conquered by Alexander in India, but he died. His adopted son, Hadrian, came to power and resumed the moderate attitude held by the emperors before Trajan. He withdrew from the lands conquered by Trajan in the east, admitting that he himself was incapable of holding the lands Trajan had conquered. Rome existed peacefully under Hadrian, who traveled throughout the empire to every province. He sought to solidify Rome's holdings rather than continue its expanse outwards, as the lands surrounding Rome were no longer worth the price it would take to conquer and hold them. He fortified the northern border on the Danube and began construction of the famous Hadrian Wall, separating the barbarian Scottish from the Roman Britannia. When he died, his adopted son Antonius Pius came to power and maintained the peace created by his father, giving the Roman world its most peaceful rule. Antonius's two adopted sons, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, would rule the empire together. Marcus became one of the great Stoic philosophers and wrote Meditations, one of the greatest pieces of philosophy ever written. They invaded the Parthians and sacked the capital, Ctesiphon, or modern-day Baghdad. Marcus also waged war against Rome's northern border, on the Danube, against several Germanic and Sarmatian tribes. Under his rule, the first ambassadors were sent to China, creating the first known contact between East and West. Lucius Verus would die, and Marcus's son Commodus co-ruled with him until Marcus died, leaving the empire to Commodus. Commodus was 18 when he became sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Commodus was loved by the army and the people, but hated by the Senate. He taxed the Senate to fund festivals, as well as large gladiatorial battles. Marcus Aurelius Cleander was a Roman freedman who had become a member of the Praetorian Guard and rose to power there. He was a favorite of Commodus's, and used his power to sell positions in the Senate to the highest bidder. He even sold positions as consul. He had the previous Praetorian Guard murdered and took his place. He had sold 25 positions as consul, and when a revolt occurred in Rome, he fled to Commodus. Commodus had him executed. Commodus saw himself as a god, and had statues erected around the empire portraying himself as Hercules. In 191, a fire burnt down Rome, and during the rebuilding process, Commodus declared himself Romulus, rebuilding the city and naming it Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, and had the 12 months renamed after his now 12 names. He even declared the Roman people Commodianus, or Comedians. In 192, Commodus was finally murdered by the Praetorian Guard. Pertinax then acquired the title of emperor from the Praetorian Guard, after the assassination of Commodus. He was then assassinated by the same Praetorian Guard 2 months later after they had not been paid. The Praetorian Guard then auctioned off the title of emperor to the highest bidder, showing the decline of the Roman Empire and what it had become. Didius Julianus filled the role of emperor for a short time until Septimius Severus took the empire by force, ousting Didius and executing him. Severus then defeated a rival claimant to the throne, Pescennius Niger, killing him and executing his family. He would later war with the Parthians, sack Ctesiphon, and push the border back to the Tigris. He would die of natural causes, and his son, Caracalla, came to full power, previously ruling alongside his father for 13 years. His brother Geta, second son of Septimius, had also served as co-emperor alongside their father for the previous 2 years, and shortly after their father's death, Caracalla had him assassinated. Caracalla wasn't a ruthless leader, however, creating the Edict of Caracalla, giving all Roman freedmen or men who had bought themselves out of slavery Roman citizenship. He had many large construction projects, including the famous Baths of Caracalla. He then proposed to the king of Parthia a marriage between himself and the king's daughter. After he refused the offer, Caracalla then marched east of the Tigris. He was stabbed to death by one of his own soldiers while urinating. The Praetorian prefect Macrinus, who had incentivized the soldier to kill the emperor, had the man killed 3 days later and took the title of emperor. However, at the same time, Elagabalus was declared emperor by the Syrian legions. His general defeated Macrinus at the Battle of Antioch, and he became emperor, but he was hated by the army due to many rumors surrounding his activities in the High Palace. He was murdered by the Praetorian Guard 3 years into his reign. Severus Alexander, another cousin of Caracalla's, then came into power. He saw the rise of the Sassanid Empire to the east, and confronted the growing empire. To the north, Rome faced yet another great swarm of Germanic barbarians, flooding in from the Rhine and Danube. Severus believed that his large Roman army would cause the barbarians to flee in fear, but after they did not, he panicked, and attempted to pay off the barbarians with large sums of gold to leave. The army had grown tired of his weakness, and had him assassinated, replacing him with Maximinus Thrax, a powerful, strong man of plebeian Thracian birth. He controlled the empire with an iron fist, having those he suspected of having ties to Severus executed without a second thought. He conquered large swaths of Germanic lands, defeating tribe after tribe, while to the south, a man from Rome's old enemy created a new enemy for him to face. The governor of what was once Carthage, Marcus Antonius Gordianus Semprianus, or Gordian I, and his son, Gordian II, had been proclaimed co-emperors by the legions stationed there. The Senate, growing to hate the heavy-handed rule of Maximinus, decided to proclaim the men emperors. Maximinus turned his attention away from the barbarians in the north, towards Rome in the south. However, before he reached Rome, he was murdered by his own men, and Capulianus, governor of Numidia, marched into Africa and defeated the rebel army, killing Gordian II, resulting in his father's suicide. The Senate only saw one way out of the situation, and declared the two of themselves to be co-emperors, Papienus and Balbinus. The Roman people rioted over the decision, which led to the Senate electing Gordian III emperor. Papienus and Balbinus would bicker amongst each other before both being murdered by the Praetorian Guard. The land gained in the north was slowly lost, and the eastern Sassanid Empire was growing in strength. To counter the growing empire, Gordian marched east to face them. Rome pushed the Sassanids back across the Euphrates, and Gordian planned on pushing further into the enemy territory when his father-in-law and Praetorian prefect, Timotheus, suddenly died. 2 brothers, Gaius Julius Priscus and Marcus Julius Philippus, became Praetorian prefects, and the Roman advance continued. Rome pushed deep into Sassanid territory, but were pushed back to Ctesiphon and ultimately crushed at the Battle of Misiche, where Gordian III died. Marcus Julius Philippus, otherwise known as Philip the Arab, then took the title of emperor. However, the economic crisis caused by the rule of Maximinus was tearing Rome apart. Philip increased taxes across the empire and stopped paying the Germanic tribes in the north to remain peaceful. The Germanic tribe, known as the Carpi, invaded after not receiving tribute. Philip defeated them and returned to Rome to celebrate the Ludi Secularis, the giant celebration celebrating 1,000 years of Roman Empire. Parades were held, 1,000 gladiators were killed, and exotic animals from all around the empire were put on display. And as Rome celebrated, the collapse of the empire was hastened by the immense spending on the celebration. The legions of Pannonia and Moesia rebelled, declaring Tiberius Claudius Pasitianus emperor of Rome. In the confusion, the invading Quadi turned into Pannonia and raided through the northern provinces. Meanwhile, Marcus Tertullianus led an uprising in response to the overtaxation of the eastern provinces. Philip offered to resign from the position as emperor, but one senator, Decius, supported him, encouraging him to continue his rule. Philip sent Decius to put down the rebellion in the east. Decius was declared emperor and turned around with the support of the northern legions to march on Rome. Meanwhile, the economic downfall caused riots in Egypt, which halted the largest supply of grain in the empire. Philip marched to face Decius, but was defeated and killed in battle. Decius began his rule by persecuting the Christian population in the empire. At a time when the Roman identity and morale was in a faltering position, he attempted to use the Christian minority as a scapegoat for the Roman people. But the barbarians in the north stood ready to remind the Romans of who the true enemy of Rome was. The barbarian raids on the border became more and more ferocious and frequent, until the barbarians had pushed deep into Roman lands. The governor of Thrace decided to side with the barbarians, and declared himself emperor with their support, but was soon after killed by them. The barbarians then returned to their homeland with the loot and Roman captives, some of whom were senators. Decius and his son Herennius Etruscus chased the barbarians as they ran, to retrieve the wealth taken from Rome, and to face the large army in the Battle of Abritus. In the battle, Herennius was killed, and Decius famously commanded to his men, "Let no one mourn. The death of one soldier is not a great loss to the Republic." Despite his determination, the Romans were crushed, and Decius would also be killed in the battle, becoming the first emperor to die in a battle against a foreign army. Decius' second son, Hostilian, became emperor after his father, and vowed to defeat the Gothic barbarians for what they had done, but died of plague months after coming into office. Rome would then see Trebonius Gallus as emperor, who would be killed by his own men shortly after coming into power, in favor of Aemilian, who would likewise be killed by his own troops in favor of Valerian. Valerian continued the trend of persecuting the Christians in attempts to keep Rome together, and moved out to face the foreign Sassanids to further the attention of the Roman people away from themselves and towards the foreign enemy. Valerian would be defeated, and would become the first Roman emperor to become a prisoner of war. The Sassanid king, Shapur, would force Valerian to drink molten gold. Valerian's son, Gallienus, would become ruler of Rome, but shortly after the capture and murder of a Roman emperor in foreign lands, the general, Postumus, declared his own realm, seceding Britannia, Iberia, Germania, and Gaul. Postumus then moved on Cologne to find and kill Gallienus' son, Saloninus. The Roman Empire would remain in a standstill against the Gallic Empire for years. To the east, the Heruli invaded across the Black Sea, pillaging Greek cities. The Romans defeated the invading fleet, and gave the general responsible, Claudius II, the title of Gothicus, and then the title of emperor after the murder of Gallienus. Claudius turned his attention to the Alemanni, who were invading across the Alps. Defeating them, he turned his attention towards the Gallic Empire, taking Hispania back for Rome. He then moved to the east to face the invading Vandals, but died of plague before he could face them. To the east, more problems erupted in Rome, as the eastern provinces had been conquered by Zenobia, the queen of the newly established Palmyrene Empire. Aurelian, Claudius' successor, came to power after him, easily defeating the Vandals and then turning his attention to the rebels in the east. After conquering them, he moved to the Gallic Empire in the west, and finally reunited the empire under Roman rule. Aurelian sought more than just reunification, and set out to the east to conquer the Sassanids. The empire had been weakened in the same way that Rome had. With the deaths of Shapur and his successors, the east seemed ready for the taking. But on his way to re-establish the glory of Rome, he was murdered by the Praetorian Guard, who were dissatisfied with his heavy-handed rule. The Senate elected Tacitus to rule shortly after the death of Aurelian, who killed the assassins of Aurelian, shortly before being assassinated himself. His brother Florian then came to power, who was yet again assassinated by his own men. Probus was declared emperor after the death of Florian, and was then murdered by his own men, declaring Carus emperor. Carus would move to face the Sassanids the same way Aurelian had, but died of plague on his way to face them. His son Numerian acquired the empire after his father, and continued eastward to face the Sassanids, but died of plague before reaching the enemy. After his death, his generals elected Diocletian emperor. Numerian's blood brother Carinus moved out from Rome to face him. Diocletian crushed Carinus, and at the Battle of the Margus River, Carinus was killed. Diocletian began his rule by defeating several invading barbarian tribes throughout the empire. He then made an unprecedented move in Roman history, and recognized Maximian as co-ruler of the empire, giving him the title of Augustus, declaring that Rome would have 2 emperors in the future. Then to further this development, each emperor declared themselves new princes, or Caesar. Diocletian appointed Galerius his Caesar, and Maximian chose Constantius. Rome was now divided into 4 roughly equal parts, with each ruling independently in their own sovereign land. When Diocletian and Maximian abdicated, Galerius and Constantius became Augusti, and appointed new Caesar, Galerius Maximinius Dia, and Constantius Severus II. The resulting transfer of power took place with no bloodshed or conflict within the empire, for the first time in centuries. However, conflict would arise when Constantius died of natural causes. The newly appointed law had laid in place that the Caesar would take the place of Augustus after their death, but Constantius's army appointed his son Constantine emperor. Maximian's son, Maxentius, also desired the title of Augustus, and traveled to the Senate in Rome to demand that they recognize him. The Senate recognized him, and after he pleaded with his father, forced Severus to abdicate. But after, a meeting was held to prevent civil war, and it was decided that Constantine would take the position of Caesar, underneath his new Augustus, named Licinius. In the east, Galerius would keep the title of Augustus, and Severus II Dia, Caesar. When Galerius died, conflict broke out, as Licinius, who was technically Augustus of the West, was living in the East, and came into conflict with Maximinus. He strengthened his position by proclaiming Constantine Emperor of the West, while Maximinus allied with Maxentius, son of Maximianus. The first conflict came about when Constantine crossed the Alps and defeated Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. During the battle, Constantine famously saw the Christian cross appear in the distance, emanating from the sun, proclaiming, "With this sign you shall win." The night after the victory, he had a dream, in which Christ came to him with the same cross, telling him to create the laborum for his army, portraying the first two Greek letters for Christ at the top of the standard. The following year, Licinius defeated Maximinus Dia, in a meeting held to secure peace with Licinius by marrying his half-sister Constantia to himself. Years later, it was declared that Christianity would be fully tolerated by the empire. The relationship between the two would slowly deteriorate until they faced each other for the final time. Licinius with Gothic mercenaries, representing the ancient pagan ways of Rome, and Constantine with his Frankish warriors, displaying the future of Rome with their laborum held high. On September 18th, 324, the fate of Rome and the entire world would be decided at the Battle of Chrysopolis. Licinius surrendered, and would eventually be executed along with his son, daughter, and half-sister by Constantine. In this, Constantine became sole Augustus, and the first Christian emperor of Rome. Constantine sought to spread his beloved religion to the newly acquired eastern half of the empire, by constructing a new city to solidify the east under his Christian rule. The city of Byzantium was chosen. Constantine renamed it Constantinopolis, or Constantine City. The temples to the old gods were replaced by churches to Constantine's new god, and Constantinople was founded. After the death of Constantine, his three sons murdered the rest of the family, vying for power, becoming the Augusti. Leading the empire split across three divisions: Constantine II in the west, Constans in the center, and Constantius II in the east. However, Constantine II began to demand more land as the eldest son, and when he marched to Italy to make his demands, he was killed, along with the small force accompanying him. Constans would inherit his older brother's realm and settle Rome into east and west. But Constans' rule would come to an end, as he created enemies among his people. In 350 AD, the army assassinated Constans, declaring his general Magentius Augustus. Magentius made sure to support both the Christian and pagan populace in the empire, and gained a secure control of Constans' lands. He moved east to capture the lands that he had not yet retrieved from Constans' empire. Constantius II diverted his attention away from the Sassanid Empire in the east, and moved to meet the usurper. The two forces met at the Battle of Mursa Major, where Magentius's outnumbered army was defeated, and he was forced to retreat to Gaul, where his army made a final stand. After being defeated again, he committed suicide by falling on his sword. Constantius II had now unified the empire under his dominion. After putting down several rebellions, he died of natural causes, and his cousin, Julian, became emperor. Julian restored many of the empire's old traditions. Being the last pagan Augustus, he not only welcomed Christianity, as it had become widespread in the empire, but also supported the pagan population in the empire. He didn't attempt to reinstate the recently created system of rule in which many emperors rule at a time. He attempted to restore Rome's glory and defeated several barbarian tribes and kingdoms in the north. He set out to the east to conquer the Sassanids under Shapur II. After pushing deep into the empire, they reached Ctesiphon. Shapur and his army were still at large, but Julian believed reinforcements were on the way and moved past the city. But the Sassanids began to harass Julian's army, burning pasture and food supplies along the way. The Romans were forced to retreat, and during the withdrawal faced a Sassanid army, where Julian faced a mortal wound. Julian would die shortly after the battle, and his general, Jovian, would be proclaimed emperor. Jovian led the Romans to safety, and reinstalled Christianity as the head religion of the empire. He died of natural causes shortly after, and Valentinian was elected emperor by the army. Valentinian elected his brother, Valens, Augustus of the East, and appointed his son Gratian, Caesar of the West, under him. Valentinian's men defeated uprisings in Africa and Britain, and fought against the barbarian hordes in the north, crossing over both the Rhine and the Danube, being the last emperor to do so. After defeating one such tribe, the Quadi, he held a meeting against the chieftains to decide their fate. The men told the emperor that there were some members of the Quadi who were not loyal to them, who might continue to attack the Romans, and went on to blame the Romans for building forts in their lands, for their raids on the empire. Valentinian went on a rampage, yelling at the barbarians, and as a result, suffered a burst blood vessel in his skull, killing him. His brother Valens would go on to die in a battle against the Goths in the east, and his son Gratian would be murdered by his own men. Valentinian II would become the emperor of the west, and Theodosius, son-in-law of Valentinian, would be Augustus in the east. Valentinian would go on to commit suicide, leaving Theodosius the whole empire. Theodosius declared Nicene Trinitarian Christianity the only recognized religion in the empire, condemning other branches of Christianity, foolish madmen, and withdrawing any state support for any of the pagan beliefs remaining in the empire. When Theodosius died, the united Roman Empire died with him. His son Arcadius, who had ruled underneath him in the east, became emperor of the Roman Empire in the east, and his other son, Honorius, became emperor of the west. The two brothers were dominated in their rule, both too weak to control the empire. Honorius was primarily controlled by a Vandal named Flavius Stilicho, and Arcadius dominated by a man known as Rufinus. The two puppet emperors were played against each other for the benefit of those controlling them, and both died of natural causes. Honorius, however, suffered several rebellions, resulting in a slow loss of control of the West. As the generations went on, and new emperors came to power, the East remained strong, coming to be known as the Byzantine Empire, after the city that founded it, Byzantium. The West would slowly crumble, losing parts of the Iberian Peninsula, then Africa, and then Gaul, and then finally, Italy, submitting the empire to the foreign barbarian Odoacer at the hands of the last emperor of Rome, ironically named Romulus Augustulus. The Byzantines, who thought of themselves as Romans, and were only named Byzantines in modern times, would go on to conquer most of the Western Empire under Justinian. The legacy that Rome leaves can be seen in every facet of modern society. The Latin language and its descendants can be found all across Europe and the Americas. The Latin script is used by most of the world. The names for the planets, the days of the week, science and philosophy, modern law is largely derived from the law Romans created. Systems of government, including the ideas of the Senate and the Republic. Road systems all across Europe and the Mediterranean, all of which lead to Rome. And the most common religion in the world, Christianity, all created and propagated from within the Roman Empire.